Søren Kierkegard, a cry amidst the Copenhagen mist. Hello. Tonight, we will no longer stay in this familiar room. Together, we will embark on a journey across the ocean, traveling back in time over 200 years to a land where the mist from the Baltic Sea always rolls thick over the gray cobblestone streets of Northern Europe. You feel the space around you fading, giving way to the salty chill of the Danish sea breeze. We are standing in front of house number 2 at Nytorv Square, right in the heart of the ancient capital of Copenhagen, where horse-drawn carriages clatter on the stone roads and oil lamps cast a pale, melancholy yellow glow. Here, in this spacious yet eerily silent home, you will witness a life molded from the darkness of curses and then shining like a lonely lighthouse amidst an ocean of falsehoods. You would surely feel an invisible weight pressing against your chest if you were born in that house. You walk through polished wooden hallways where the sighs of a sternly devout father always last longer than a child's laughter. The whole world outside might be rushing with revolutions, but within the fortress of Nytorv, time seems frozen in a hereditary melancholy. You will meet a thin boy with eyes far too deep for a 5-year-old, a child who, from his very first breath, was surrounded by the ghosts of death and sentences from the heavens. His father was a wealthy merchant who lived like a sinner awaiting judgment day, while his mother was but a quiet shadow, present yet invisible in the grand histories of human thought. This is the beginning of the Søren Kierkegaard biography for Sleep Script, a journey leading you deep into the inner mind of a lonely genius in the thought-filled land of Mind Manor. Before we let go of all worries to sink deep into this space of memory, do not forget to hit like and subscribe to the channel if you feel the stories I bring here can soothe your soul. Please leave a comment about where you are listening to this story and what time it is in your night. I read them all, simply so that the kindred spirits among us can find each other in this vast night, and so I know where your night begins. Now, adjust your pillow until it is perfectly soft. Pull the warm blanket up to your chest and let the cold air of Copenhagen in 1813 slowly envelop your mind. Tonight is a night of paradoxes and daring leaps of faith, a year of devalued banknotes and bleeding souls searching for truth in the heart of a decaying kingdom. Part 1. Born into a family haunted by guilt. You open your eyes to a gray afternoon in Copenhagen, where mists from the Baltic Sea roll in, embracing the steep rooftops and the gray cobblestone streets. The air carries the scent of smoldering coal and the saltiness of the sea, but overhanging everything is an eerie silence. You feel your body small, your thin hands touching the coarse bed sheets in the house at Nytorv number 2. This is 1813, the year of your birth, a milestone you would later recall with a bitter smile. The year, as Soren later put it, in which so many bad notes were put into circulation. Copenhagen at this time is not a magnificent city. It is a body bleeding from the wounds of history. Only 6 years prior, firestorms from the British Navy turned a third of the city to ash. You can hear the echoes of collapsing buildings in the memories of those around you, the dull ache of a nation that has just declared bankruptcy, lost its territory, and is spiritually exhausted. You were born into an era of disintegration, where old values are crumbling, and the paper money in your father's hands is nothing but hollow promises. Was it destiny that arranged for you to become a bad note in a decaying system? Or are you the only true value left amidst a world of lies? You step onto the polished wooden floor, feeling the cold transfer through the soles of your feet. This house is large and grand, but its breath seems too heavy for a child. Your father, Michael Pedersen Kierkegard, appears like the shadow of an old austere tree. When you let out your first cry at birth, he was already 56, an age when people usually prepare for rest rather than beginning to raise their youngest child. You called yourself a child of old age, and that generational gap was measured not just in years, but by an abyss of melancholy. In the corner of the room, your mother, Anne Lund, works quietly. She is a strange presence, a small, gentle woman who is like a ghost in her own home. You look at her, trying to find an image or a word of hers in your later journals, but find only a white void. She was once the Mai who stepped into your father's life in haste after his first wife passed away, carrying his child before the wedding could be held. Her presence was present, but invisible. Do you ever wonder why your genius intellect rejected the woman who bore you? Or was it her silence that taught you that the deepest things are never spoken aloud? Your name, Kierkegaard, rings in your head like a bell from a graveyard. In Danish, it means churchyard or cemetery. This name is no accident. It stems from the church's farmland in Jutland that your ancestors once cultivated. You carry the name of death from the very beginning. Every time someone calls your name, they are reminding you of the end of every human life. You do not live in an ordinary house. You live in a land of remembrance, where shadows are always longer than the light. You feel a shiver run down your spine when you think of your father. He was not just a wealthy merchant, he was a cursed soul. Imagine an 11-year-old boy named Michael, standing in the middle of the desolate heaths of Jutland, his body trembling from hunger and the bone-chilling cold of the north. In utter despair, that boy stood upon a hill, looked up at the gray sky, and cursed God. That curse took only seconds to utter, but it took 71 years to gnaw away at his soul. Later, having become one of the wealthiest men in Copenhagen, thanks to his sharp intellect and lucky investments during the bankruptcy era, your father still could not find peace. His wealth was like a mockery of fate. He believed God was not blessing him, but was fattening him up in preparation for a more cruel punishment. He was trapped in a deep melancholy, a spiritual sickness he passed down to you like an unavoidable inheritance. He was certain that, because of his childhood sin of blasphemy, God would be taking the lives of all 7 of his children before they reached the age of 3, for the age of Jesus Christ at his crucifixion. You stand in the dark hallway, looking into empty rooms. That curse seemed real. You witnessed your brothers and sisters pass away one by one. Your home was not a sanctuary. The household became a tomb where children were raised to expect death. Each funeral was a cross through the family history, and each time your father sank deeper into austerity. You breathe in that air, thick with the scent of mourning, and you realize you were born not to play, but to endure existence. You had no childhood. You often said you were born old. Instead of toys, your father placed in your hands the image of the bleeding Moravian crucifix. You did not learn of a merciful Jesus, but of a man spat upon by the whole world, a witness to the truth who had to suffer. Even as a small child, I was told, as solemnly as possible, that everyone spat at Christ, who indeed was the truth, that the multitude, those who passed by, spat at him and said, "Shame on you. I have kept this deep in my heart. This thought is my life." Your education was a painful abnormality. You were kept indoors, isolated from children your own age. But your father gave you another world. Imaginary walks through Copenhagen without leaving their sitting room. He would describe the streets of Copenhagen to you with such vivid detail that you could smell the toasted bread from the bakery and hear the clatter of carriages on the street. He taught you that the mind is stronger than reality, that you can go anywhere without leaving your room. But it was this very method that created a demented upbringing, turning your soul into a shard of broken glass, sharp and reflecting the distorted images of a melancholy old man. You created a shell for yourself. At family gatherings, you were the mischievous child with a sharp tongue. When they asked what you wanted to become, you replied you wanted to be a fork. A fork to spear anything you wanted, and to spear those who dared to stop you. That nickname, the fork, was your first weapon. You learned to use irony to hide your fear of lurking death, using intellect to build a fortress separating yourself from a world full of curses. Everything you experienced from 1813 to 1820 was not just historical events. They were the bricks that built your philosophical tower later on. Your father bequeathed to his surviving sons, Peter and Søren, not only material wealth, but also supremely sharp intellect, a fathomless sense of guilt, and a relentless burden of melancholy. You were forged in psychological fire from birth. Anxiety, angst, and despair were not concepts you learned from books. They were the heartbeat of your soul, the darkness beneath your bed every night. You understood that to live is to choose, and every choice carries the weight of eternity. Existence, for you, was never a light or obvious thing. It was an unequal battle between the tiny self and the judgment of God. You rise from the wooden chair, feeling the last warmth of the sun fading outside the Nytorv window. Darkness begins to crawl across the walls, obscuring the family portraits. You reach for your thick coat, fastening each button carefully, preparing to step out of the door of this melancholy house. The sound of your shoes tapping on the wooden floor echoes steadily, breaking the silence of the empty rooms as you walk toward the dim light of the hallway, leading the way to a new chapter of life, where schools and new knowledge await to test your faith. Part 2. Studying at the School of Civic Virtue in Copenhagen. The school bells of Borgerdydskolen ring out dryly, piercing the quiet morning air of Copenhagen. You find yourself standing before the heavy gates of what is known as the School of Civic Virtue. The scent of India ink, old pages, and the smell of wood dust from rows of ancient desks hits your nostrils, carrying a sensation that is both solemn and suffocating. In 1821, you enter here not with the heart of a child seeking joy, but as a young soldier entering a training ground under the strict supervision of your father. Your father, Michael, chose this place, the most prestigious and rigorous educational institution in the capital, not for you to explore freely, but to mold you into a symbol of discipline and erudite scholarship. Could the virtue praised by the world truly be the salvation for your melancholy soul? Or was it merely a steel mold attempting to shape a sprout that already bore a peculiar form? You sit down on a rigid wooden chair in the classroom, where Latin echoes for hours on end. Here, this ancient language is not just a subject, it is the breath and the measure of intellect. You immerse yourself in complex grammatical structures, the prose of Cicero, or the poetry of Virgil. The time devoted to Latin is more than double that of any other subject, and it is within the confines of these classical linguistic rules that your logical thinking begins to become as sharp as a blade. You learn to analyze every fiber of thought, learning how the ancient Greeks built the world with concepts. Socrates, the spiritual teacher you would pursue for a lifetime, begins to appear within those pages, sowing the first seeds of irony and endless questions in your heart. But a painful paradox unfolds on the white pages before you. While you can easily grasp dead languages, you find yourself struggling strangely with your mother tongue. Your classmates look at you with curious eyes as they saw you struggling with a Danish composition. It is ironic how a man who would later reshape the style of an entire nation, reveling Hans Christian Andersen as one of the two great stylists of the Danish language, was once judged to be a poor writer. Your early style was heavy and dry, dense with Germanic constructions and Latin phrases. Was it because your soul at that time was too immense to navigate through ordinary sentence structures? Or were you intentionally using that dry erudition as a shield to hide the awkwardness of a heart bleeding from melancholy? You walk out into the schoolyard during break, and immediately you feel eyes fixed upon you. You know you are different. With your spindly stature, your shoulders slightly slumped under the weight of your thoughts, you wore plain, unfashionable apparel chosen by your devout father. Amidst classmates full of vitality and the soulless cruelty of youth, you appear as a contrary question mark. The taunts and laughter at your physical form ring across the playground. These years were truly a social hell, as school was socially difficult. You are isolated, turned into a target for malicious jokes, but you do not cry, nor do you back down. You realize that if your body cannot win in physical brawls, then your intellect will crush your opponents in verbal battles. Language began to become your weapon. You learned that language was a weapon. You refine your capacity for sarcasm to a point of bitterness, honing a caustic wit and a canny appreciation of other people's psychological weaknesses. Whenever a bully approaches, you do not use fists. You use precise and sharp words to pierce through their shell of complacency, finding the exact words to wound. You become skilled at verbal combat. Irony at this time was a mechanism of self-defense. It was self-defense, a survival instinct, so you could stand firm amidst a hostile crowd. You whisper to yourself that if the world is cruel to the truth, you will use irony to strip away its lies. You remember that dinner, when the warmth from the fireplace was not enough to dispel the cold in your father's eyes. When asked about your future dreams, you looked directly at those around you and declared you wanted to become a fork, a response that left everyone stunned. A fork to spear anything you wanted, and if anyone tried to stop you, you would then spear the person who attempted to stop you. The nickname, the Fork, stayed with you from then on, not just as a tease, but as a warning of an intellect ready to penetrate every barrier and every complacency of the age. You do not want to dissolve into the crowd. You want to stand outside and use your sharpness to perform surgery on the human soul. Despite possessing a rebellious intellect, you still carry a strangely very conservative stance. You honor the king, love the church, and respect social order. It is the legacy of Michael, the father who taught you that order is the wall separating man from the abyss of sin. You are a model youth by the standards of the time, someone who would honor the king, love the church, and respect the police. But this conservatism does not bring you peace. It creates a fierce internal conflict. You see the emptiness in the teacher's lectures, the hypocrisy in the religious rituals you still fully attend. You treat your teachers with an attitude that was ambivalent toward your teachers, using judgmental eyes to see through the flaws behind the dignified robes. In 1828, under the dome of Vorfru Kirke, you kneel to receive confirmation. The one performing the ceremony is Pastor J.P. Minster, your father's close friend and a symbol of Danish religious authority. In that sacred moment, you feel the weight of the state religious system pressing onto your shoulders. This is the moment you officially enter the life of faith, but also the time when the seeds of dissatisfaction begin to sprout. Does the man blessing you truly stand as a witness to the truth, or is he merely a gear in a smooth and hypocritical religious machine? This event ties you to a community that you would later call the crowd, which is untrue. Your father's shadow still hangs over every corner of your soul. Evenings spent learning about the suffering of Christ through Moravian pietism have seeped into your flesh and blood. You believe that truth always comes with suffering, and the bullying at school is merely evidence reinforcing that grim belief. The world to you is a place where goodness is always crucified, and solitude is the price to be paid for righteousness. You sink deep into introspection, nurturing melancholy as your only soulmate. You learn that to survive, you must become a master of psychology, one who can read the smallest movements in the souls of others. It was at Borgerdydskolen that you began to practice the art of indirect communication that you learned from Socrates. You understand that truth cannot be given like a gift. It must be discovered through friction, pain, and ironic questions. The suffering of isolation taught you how to see through social masks, laying the foundation for your later profound psychological works concerning anxiety and despair. You are no longer an ordinary thin schoolboy. You are gradually becoming an explorer of the dark regions of the mind. The sound of your shoes taps against the dry cobblestones as you leave the school of civic virtue for the last time. You tighten your scarf, feeling the cold wind blowing from the Copenhagen harbor, carrying the salt and the promise of a new horizon. The city's tall buildings begin to light up, their pale yellow light reflecting in the puddles on the path. You do not look back at the old school. Your steps are resolute toward the ancient buildings of the University of Copenhagen, where debates on faith and the seismic events of life await to crush and reborn you once more. The school days have closed, but the real battle to find the meaning of existence has now officially begun beneath the gray sky of adulthood. Part 3. Starting university and experiencing the seismic event. The heels of your boots echo on the cold stones leading to the gates of the University of Copenhagen on a late October morning in 1830. The wind from the Baltic Sea blows through, bringing a biting cold that seeps into your thin coat, but the anxiety in your heart is colder still. You bow your head, your hand clutching the registration papers for the Faculty of Theology. This is your father's wish, the path Michael Pedersen Kierkegard laid out to turn his youngest son into a model pastor of the Danish church. Yet, as the warmth of the ancient libraries envelops you, the scent of old paper and the dust of time bring no peace, only suffocation. Your mind, already sharpened by irony and doubt, begins to veer off course. Instead of dry dogmas on sin and redemption, you find yourself drawn into the labyrinth of philosophy, drama, and poetry. You long to touch the vivid reality of human existence, rather than the abstract systems of Hegel that dominate the lecture halls of the time. Are you seeking God, or are you trying to escape the shadow of a father who viewed God as a ruthless judge? Fate also seems intent on reminding you of your own distinctiveness. Only a few days after enrolling, you are called into the Royal Guard. But standing among robust young men, your spindly and frail frame appears as an error of nature. After just 3 short days, you receive discharge papers with the cold words, "Discharged as unfit for service." You walk out of the barracks, feeling relief, yet also bitterness. This world has no place for you in the army, just as it seems to have no place for you in quiet dogmas. You return to the streets of Copenhagen, where you decide to live an entirely different life, the life of an aesthetician, a flashy dandy. You enter the most luxurious cafes in the capital, where tobacco smoke mingles with fiery intellectual debates. You spend your father's money wastefully on expensive suits, theater outings, and all-night parties. You strive to be the center of the literary elite around Professor Heiberg, using your wit and sharp intelligence to entertain the crowd. Every laugh of yours amidst the festivities is an attempt to drown out the silent scream in your soul. You wear a witty, charming mask, but deep down, you know you are drifting aimlessly through a relatively dissolute time. The mounting debts that your father reluctantly pays are like invisible chains binding you to the reality you despise. What are you trying to escape? Is it the meaninglessness of existence, or the death that stalks your family every day? On the 15th of April, 1834, as candlelight flickers in a small room, you take up a quill and set down the first lines of your journal. This is not merely an act of recording. It is a lifelong surgery of the soul. You realize that you must understand yourself before you can know what you are to do with your life. Each journal page is a step into the inner labyrinth, where you face your prayers and fiercest struggles. But in that same year, darkness falls once more. Your mother passes away. Strangely, in thousands of journal pages filled with thoughts on your father, sin, and God, you are completely silent regarding her death. Anne Sørenstotter Lund vanishes from the pages just as she quietly existed in the house at Nytorv. This silence is an abyss. Was she too holy for you to touch with ironic words? Or was she part of a reality too painful for you to face? By then, 5 of your 7 siblings lay beneath cold stone graves. Your home was now merely a station for coffins. Death was no longer an abstract concept in a theology textbook. It was the scent of funeral flowers lingering in your breath. And then, 1835 arrives, bringing a tremor you would later call the Great Earthquake. You stand there in your father's darkened room and discover the horrific secret that had stifled Michael Kierkegaard's life for 7 decades. The image of an 11-year-old shepherd boy standing on a Jutland hill, cursing God out of hunger, suddenly becomes the answer to every tragedy in your family. You realize that all your father's wealth, intelligence, and longevity were not blessings, but a fattening for the day of judgment. Your father was an unhappy man who believed he had to survive to witness the deaths of all his children as a punishment from heaven. This truth crushes you. Your worldview collapses like a building in a seismic shift. It was then that the great earthquake occurred, the terrible upheaval which suddenly pressed on me a new infallible law for the interpretation of all phenomena. It was then I suspected my father's great age was not a divine blessing, but rather a curse. A guilt must weigh on the entire family. God's punishment must be upon it. It was meant to disappear. You see yourself not as a free individual, but as part of a failed experiment of God, an effort to be erased. Anger and despair drive you to ultimate rebellion. You move out of the house, cutting ties with the father you both loved and feared. You abandon the Christian faith, plunging into a dissolute lifestyle as a way to take revenge on fate. Nights of heavy drinking, moments of excessive spending, you try to become another person to escape the name Kierkegard. You want to prove you can live without God's judgment, but every glass of wine you drink seems only to increase your thirst for meaning. Your father stands there, silently watching your degradation, believing the curse is coming true as he loses his final child to spiritual abandonment. Two men, one old and one young, both look into the abyss of despair in different ways. However, it was precisely during those dark days of rebellion that a philosopher was taking shape. You realize that the life of an aesthetician constantly seeking the interesting to escape boredom is actually a cowardly flight from the self. You see the emptiness behind your sharp sarcasms. You begin to admire Socrates, not because he had the answers, but because he dared to live by the questions. You promise yourself to become a Socrates of the Christian world, a man whose mission is destined not to comfort people with easy truths, but to disturb them into real faith. You understand that true faith does not lie in grand lectures, but in fear and trembling when facing the absolute. You set your pen down. The candlelight in the cheap rented room flickers and dies, leaving the pungent smell of burnt wax in the narrow space. You stand up, walk to the window, and look down at the streets of Copenhagen at midnight. Dim oil lamps cast shadows on the puddles, creating distorted streaks of light like your own soul at this moment. You put on your long cloak, feeling the coarse fabric touch your collar, and quietly step out the door. The sound of your shoes echoes lonely in the old wooden hallway as you walk down the stairs to merge into the darkness of the narrow alleys, where the city's silence is waiting to whisper in your ear about the coming deaths and the departure of a man who sowed a curse into your very flesh. Part 4. Father's Death, Inheritance, and Engagement to Regine. The scent of wax candles mingles with the smell of old paper and the faint aroma of tea in the room at Nytorv. You feel the warmth of your father, Michael's hand, trembling as he grasps yours during the final days of the summer of 1838. The long-standing tension and distance suddenly vanish, giving way to an uncanny stillness. On May 19 of that year, you wrote in your journal of an indescribable joy. This was not the superficial joy of Copenhagen tea parties, but a spiritual liberation, a moment when it seemed the curse hanging over your family had finally loosened its grip. You look into the clouded eyes of your 82-year-old father, seeing there no longer a ruthless judge of God, but merely an old man seeking forgiveness from his last remaining son. This reconciliation is a belated salvation, but it is enough to warm a soul that had been frozen through years of rebellion. Is this the start of a new life, or merely the prelude to a series of even more brutal sacrifices? On the night of the 8th of August, 1838, silence envelops the house at number 2. Michael Pedersen Kierkegaard has drawn his last breath. You stand by your father's remains at Assiston Cemetery, watching the first handfuls of earth fall onto the oak coffin. The sound of earth hitting wood echoes like the rhythmic knocks of destiny. Your father's death leaves not only a vast void in your mind, but also a massive fortune, 31,000 Rigs Bankdaler. Suddenly, you are one of the wealthiest men in the city, possessing an inheritance sufficient to live as an aristocrat for the rest of your days without ever lifting a finger. Yet you understand that along with those gold coins, you have also inherited the full weight of his spiritual estate, a profound melancholy, constant anxiety, and an imagination so vivid it borders on agony. You are materially rich, but spiritually bankrupt toward God. Just a month after the funeral, driven by a strange intellectual urge, you publish your debut work. From the papers of one still living, you choose Hans Christian Andersen as the subject of your dissection. You disagree with his notion that genius can be crushed by circumstances. You write with a sharp voice, asserting that adversity does not extinguish genius. It tempers it and makes the flame burn brighter. Are you writing about Andersen, or are you actually writing for yourself? You are trying to convince yourself that family tragedies, the deaths of siblings, and hereditary melancholy are the furnace forging your greatness. You begin to realize that a true work must carry a mature view of life, a unity between painful experience and philosophical thought. The weight of the promise made to your late father pushes you back to dry theology books. On the 3rd of July 1840, you walked out of the examination room with your degree, magna cum laude. You have achieved what your father always yearned for, yet there is no complacency in your heart. In his memory, you undertake a journey to the remote Jutland countryside, the origin of that blasphemous cry from years ago. You stand amidst desolate fields, hearing the wind whistle through dry bushes, and feel the pain of the shepherd boy Michael. This trip is not just a return to roots, but a pilgrimage into the past to close old wounds. You enroll in the pastoral seminary, completing all the formalities to become a priest. But deep inside, you know you will never stand in a pulpit to dispense hollow comforts. You have another mission, another pulpit, waiting in the pages of anonymous writings. Amidst the shifts of thought and responsibility, a brilliant light suddenly pierces through your fog of melancholy. That light is Regine Olsen. You recall the first moment you met her in the spring of 1837 at Fredericksburg. She was only 15 then, a sapling full of life, her fingers gliding over piano keys. Her music was like a foreign language to a soul accustomed only to the sounds of death. For 3 years, you stood at a distance, silently watching her grow like an astronomer tracking the brightest star in the sky. Regine possessed warmth, simplicity, and a pure love of life, everything you lacked. You were mesmerized by that contrast, yearning to touch that light, to dispel the darkness in your heart. On the 8th of September 1840, you enter Regine's house with your heart racing beneath your buttoned coat. Seeing her playing the piano, the 3 years of suppression suddenly burst forth. You approach her, interrupting the music with an intense, spontaneous proposal. "Oh, what do I care for music? See, it's you I want. I have wanted you for 2 years." Stillness fills the room for a moment, broken only by your heavy breathing. When she agrees, and when her father, Counselor Olsen, blesses the engagement on September 10, it seems you have found a harbor for your stormy life. A young, wealthy philosopher with a theology degree, engaged to the most beautiful girl in Copenhagen, is that not a happy ending for a melancholy life? Yet, only hours after the engagement ring is slipped onto Regine's finger, a brutal remorse begins to gnaw at you. You look into the mirror and see a spectral being looking back. You realize you have made an irreversible mistake. Not because you do not love Regine, you love her enough to die for her, but because you love her, you realize your presence is a poison. You are a man carrying innate melancholy, a soul ruined by shadows of the past. You know you cannot give her a normal marriage. You cannot share cozy dinners without bringing along the ghosts of the family curse. You are certain that if you marry her, your gloom will drain her vitality, leaving her withered and collapsed within months. You love her, and that is why you begin to think of leaving her. This torment pushes you into the most intense existential crisis of your 27 years. You stand at a deadly crossroad. On one side is the path of the finite, marrying Regine, becoming a pastor, living a stable life respected by society. On the other hand is the call of the infinite, becoming an outsider, an anonymous writer, one who must sacrifice personal happiness to serve a higher truth. You begin to understand that the choice is not just between two paths, but a choice of who you truly are. You believe the family curse remains and that you will die young. Binding Regine's radiant life to a man destined for death is an act of ultimate selfishness. You begin to construct a painful plan in your mind. You will turn Regine into a symbol, your own Abrahamic sacrifice, where you must offer up what you love most to reach faith. You start treating her strangely, coldly, and ironically, deliberately, leading her to believe you are a philanderer, a scoundrel, unworthy of her love. You want her to hate you, so that when the separation comes, her heart will be broken not by the pain of loss, but by contempt. Your entire life is now suspended on a decision of rupture. You are preparing for an act that will destroy your reputation in the eyes of all Copenhagen and make you a villain to the Olsen family. But it will be the starting shot for the greatest philosophical works in human history. Regine's piano music still echoes in your mind as a reminder of a paradise you can never reach. You tighten your shoelaces, feeling the stiff leather against your feet, and step out of her brightly lit house into the cold night of the streets. The oil lamps of Copenhagen cast long, flickering shadows, guiding you back to your lonely room. You walk with resolve, your shoes tapping steadily on the gray stones, your mind beginning to outline suicide notes and manuscripts full of paradoxes as you prepare to embark on a journey of escape to Berlin, where solitude will become your only companion in the search for true faith. Part 5. Broken engagement, graduation, and flight to Berlin. You feel the cold of the metal as your fingers touch the engagement ring deep in your coat pocket, a stark contrast to the weight of the doctoral dissertation sitting on your desk. This is October 1841, the moment your life is torn into two irreparable halves. One half is the glory of an intellect reaching its academic peak after 11 long, weary years amidst cafes and doubts. The other half is the wreckage of a man who has just strangled his own happiness with his own hands. Standing in a room filled with the scent of ink and candle wax, you realize that the erudition of Socrates, or the irony you so worship, can do nothing to soothe Regine's heartbreaking cries echoing from across the city. Your dissertation, on the concept of irony with continual reference to Socrates, is not merely an academic work, it is a manifesto of existence. You choose Socrates as your guide because he was the master of masks. You see yourself in the image of that Athenian philosopher who used irony as a midwife to give birth to individual subjectivity. You petitioned the king to write in Danish, an act of subtle rebellion against the rigidity of traditional Latin, as if you wanted the breath of your nation to permeate every philosophical word. But standing before the committee, you were still forced to summarize your soul into dry Latin lines to defend them. On the 20th of October 1841, the magister degree was placed in your hands, yet you do not feel like a doctor. You feel like a Socrates of Christendom, one who has just been granted the weapons to disturb the complacency of an entire era. But what was the cost of that weapon? You trace your memory back to the spring of 1837, when the piano music of 15-year-old Regine Olsen first pierced through your shell of melancholy. Oh, what do I care for music? It's you I want. I have wanted you for 2 years. That proposal was once the only hope for you to become a normal human being. But the ghost of your father, Armichael returns, whispering in your ear about the family curse, about God's punishment, and the early death waiting at the age of 34. The melancholy within you is no ordinary sadness. It is a hereditary poison from the harsh Moravian sect. You look into the mirror and see a spectral entity. You tell yourself that if you marry, your gloom will drain Regine's vitality, and within 6 months of marriage to him, she would have gone to pieces. Was it the noble sacrifice of a great man, or merely the cowardice of one who dared not face happiness? To liberate her, you chose the cruelest path possible. You played the villain. You deliberately wandered the streets, laughed in theaters, and tried to cultivate the image of a philanderer who was bored with his old flame so that Regine might hate you. He comes up with this grand idea to make himself look like the bad guy. You wanted her to believe she was merely a toy in the hands of a frivolous intellectual. But Regine, with her pure heart, saw through that clumsy performance. She did not hate you, she fought for you, and that was the true horror. On the 11th of August, 1841, when you sealed the ring and the letter of return, you knew you had just performed a leap into the absurd. The time of terrors began. All of Copenhagen looked at you like a heartless monster, a madman who had ruined a young girl's life. You accepted that humiliation just as Abraham accepted the offering of Isaac on the heights of Moriah. You abandoned the one you loved to pursue a calling you could not yet clearly name. Unable to breathe the air full of contempt in your homeland, on the 25th of October, 1841, you boarded a ship to Berlin. This journey was not a study trip. It was a voluntary exile disguised as education. You arrived in Berlin in the freezing winter, as gray winds from the North German plains swept across the vast boulevards. You sat in the dim lecture hall of Friedrich Schelling, hoping to find a philosophy that could explain your personal pain. In the crowd of listeners surrounding you were faces that would reshape the world, such as Karl Marx or Friedrich Engels. They were listening to macro-philosophical systems, to history and class. Yet you sat there, pen in hand, but your mind was in a small room in Copenhagen where Regine was weeping. You realized a bitter truth. No philosophical system, no matter how grand, can resolve the solitary existence of a bleeding individual. Schelling was as hollow as Hegel. They were merely architects building castles in the sky, while real human beings were dying in hovels on the ground. In the ultimate solitude of a rented room in Berlin, you threw yourself into writing like a madman. You wrote so as not to think, wrote to escape your own shadow. The manuscripts you brought from Denmark began to take the shape of a masterpiece, either or. You did not publish it under your own name. You chose the pseudonym Victor Eremita, the victorious hermit. You utilized the method of indirect communication because you understood that existential truth cannot be dispensed directly. It must be discovered by each person through paradoxes. You created the hedonistic character, A, and the ethical judge, William, letting them struggle within the reader's soul. Specifically, in The Seducer's Diary, you dissected your own manipulation of Regine. You used words to perform surgery on your own heart, exposing the emptiness behind the aesthetic lifestyle. That book of over 800 pages was the scream of a soul suspended between earthly duty and spiritual calling. The months in Berlin passed, in silence and nightmares of choice. You realized you could not run away forever. The loneliness in Berlin had honed you into a different person, harder, more cynical, but deeper than ever before. You were no longer the lazy student or the desperate lover. You were ready to become an independent writer, one who dared to use his pain as ink to write the histories of the soul. You understood that your life from now on would be a series of sacrifices and solitude, but that was the price to pay to wake humanity from the sleep of falsehood. On the 6th of March, 1842, you stood on the deck of the ship, watching the sharp spires of Copenhagen slowly emerge in the morning mist. The sound of waves crashing against the hull felt like the hurried beat of an unavoidable destiny. You tightened your long cloak, feeling the salty sea wind whip against your face, carrying the taste of home and the rumors that awaited. Your steps were resolute as you walked down the gangway, your black leather shoes tapping a steady rhythm on the damp wood as you merged into the bustling crowd at the harbor, preparing to return to your old house to begin a relentless attack on the complacency of Danish society with the anonymous works burning within your chest. Part 6. Publishing a mass of pseudonymous philosophical works. The steady rhythm of your leather shoes on the cobblestones of Copenhagen becomes the melody for the thoughts flowing through your veins. You walk among the bustling crowds at Kongens Nytorv Square, breathing in the damp air of a late afternoon, feeling the warmth of brief conversations with strangers. These are the people baths you so dearly love, where you find a connection to the real world after hours of imprisoning yourself in a dark room to face the ghosts of thought. But behind the leisurely appearance of a wealthy gentleman on a stroll, your soul is a furnace burning with an extraordinary intensity of creation. From 1843 to 1844, you no longer live a normal life. You have become a machine for producing words, a soul driven by a mission that no one around you can fully comprehend. Every 2 months, a new world is born from the tip of your pen, bearing unfamiliar names and distinct voices, as if you are fragmenting yourself to converse with your own being. You return to the house at Nytorv number 2, where the candlelight always burns later than any other window in the city. The vast fortune your father left behind is now not just gold coins, but the absolute freedom to turn your life into a philosophical laboratory. You sit down in the old armchair, the pungent scent of India ink mingling with the smell of draft paper piled on the table. You do not write under your real name. You understand that truth cannot be directly or immediately communicated to others. To reach the soul of the single individual, you must create a labyrinth. You begin to build a theater of voices, where each pseudonym is an actor carrying a distinct worldview. You do not wish to be a lecturing teacher. You want to be the silent director behind the scenes, forcing the audience to find their own way out of the contradictions you have laid out. In February 1843, Either or is born under the name Victor Eremita, the Victorious Hermit. You flip through each page, seeing yourself in the character A an aesthetic youth always yearning for the interesting to escape the dull boredom of existence. In The Seducer's Diary, you dissected the art of psychological manipulation coldly, using the image of Johannes the Seducer to reflect upon your broken romance with Regine. But immediately you confront yourself through the letters of Judge William, the defender of the stability of the ethical life and marriage. You place the reader before a life or death choice. Either live in the infinite but empty possibilities of the aesthetic, or commit to the finite but real responsibilities of the ethical. You advise them to choose despair to see their true self. Does anyone understand that, behind those sharp arguments, you yourself are bleeding between those two choices? In October 1843, you led your listeners into an even darker and harsher territory, the realm of the religious. Under the pseudonym Johannes de Silencio, John of the Silence, you write Fear and Trembling. You stand on Mount Moriah with Abraham, seeing the knife raised high above the head of his only son, Isaac. You challenge every ethical standard of society by introducing the concept of the teleological suspension of the ethical. You explain that Abraham is not a murderer, but a knight of faith, one who dares to perform a leap of faith into the absolute absurd. You are lonely with Abraham, for true faith can never be explained in the language of the crowd. It is an experience full of fear and trembling between the individual and God. Simultaneously, you publish Repetition, asserting that faith is not remembering the past, but a recollection forwards, an effort to reclaim what was lost through a total commitment to reality. In the summer of 1844, your creative power reached its peak, with 3 masterpieces appearing at once. You transform into Johannes Climacus in philosophical fragments to launch a direct attack on the arrogance of Hegelian reason. You present the absolute paradox. How can an eternal God become a flesh and blood human being within the flow of time? You assert this is an offense to reason, and only faith can bridge that abyss. Shortly after, you don the mask of Vigilius Haufniensis, the watchman of Copenhagen, to write The Concept of Anxiety. You stand on the edge of the abyss of existence, feeling that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. You realize anxiety is not a sickness, but evidence that humans have the power to choose, and it is the weight of that freedom that makes our souls tremble before the infinite possibilities of the future. Finally, you mock the intellectuals with Prefaces by Nicolaus Notaben, a man forbidden by his wife from writing books, who can therefore only write prefaces for books that do not exist. You laugh at those trying to build massive philosophical systems to explain the universe while forgetting how to live as a normal human being. But behind all those masks, you still reserve the most truthful part for yourself. Along with the ironic anonymous works, you always publish in parallel upbuilding discourses under your real name. You call this communicating with both hands. The left hand offers a philosophy full of traps, while the right hand holds out gentle religious comforts. You dedicate these discourses to your late father and send them to that single individual, my reader. You want the world to know that, from the beginning, your heart always belonged to faith, and philosophy was merely the means for you to awaken sleeping souls. This period of explosion exhausted your strength, but also magnified your stature. In just 2 years, you established the entire foundation for the existential philosophy of the following century. You transformed the pain of leaving Regine the obsession with your father, and your own solitude into eternal concepts. You were no longer a small individual in Copenhagen. You had become a monument of thought, one who dared to face the abyss of the soul to find the light of truth. The final draft pages of 1844 have been sealed, the scent of ink drying on the paper, and you feel an extraordinary silence envelop the room as the dawn begins to cast its first streaks of light through the window crevices. You rise from the writing desk, your body weary after an all-night session, your eyes stinging from candle smoke, but your mind still echoing with those final lines. You stretch, feeling the early morning chill seep into the room, then slowly walk toward the window to throw it open to the air. The bells of Vor Fru Kirke ring in the distance, somber and majestic, calling you back to reality. You put on your long cloak, fastening each button carefully, then step out of the room, your shoes tapping rhythmically on the old wooden stairs to begin a new day. You step out onto the street, merging into the flow of people beginning to pour into the city's thoroughfares, preparing for a new stroll among unfamiliar faces, where the next conflicts with the Corsair magazine and the public's mockery are silently taking shape behind welcoming smiles. Part 7. Conflict with the Corsair and Public Ridicule. The scent of cheap printer's ink and the dampness of freshly printed newspapers mingle in the air of the cafes in Copenhagen, creating a subtle rush that you can feel the moment you cross the threshold. In this capital, the magazine The Corsair reigns like a powerful ghost, a formless media force capable of crushing any reputation with just a few lines of biting sarcasm. You stroll past the tables, seeing Danish intellectuals surreptitiously passing the magazine, their eyes gleaming with a mix of curiosity and pleasure at seeing a famous figure dissected. Mayer Aaron Goldschmidt, the young editor of the paper, was once an admirer of your dialectical intellect to the point of worship. For a long time, he intentionally kept you out of the vortex of attacks, making you a favorite exception in the heart of a cemetery of reputations. But for a proud and lonely soul like yours, such protection was a slap to your self-esteem. You wonder, are your writings too bland, or is your stature not yet great enough for the enemy to bother? The silence of the Corsair toward you was not a gift. It was an insulting neglect. On the 22nd of December 1845, a surge of angry electricity runs down your spine as you read P.L. Muller's review targeting stages on Life's Way. Muller not only attacked the work, he was also an anonymous writer for the Corsair, a snake hiding beneath a scholarly cloak. You decide you can no longer remain silent. Under the pseudonym Frater Taciturnus, you launch a counterattack in the fatherland in January 1846. You expose Muller's true face, but more importantly, you issue a fateful challenge aimed directly at Goldschmidt. You ironically ask if they were truly satirical, truly fearless sauce. Why were they leaving him alone? You have personally opened Pandora's box of hatred, believing your intellect could stand firm against any storm, unaware that this world does not attack you with logic, but with vulgarity. The response from the Corsair comes as swift and ruthless as a backstab. Starting from January 1846, your image no longer appears with the dignity of a philosopher, but as a deformed creature on the pages of caricatures. Goldschmidt had been exaggerating his deformities and his centricity, the hunched back, the wild, disheveled hair, and especially the image of two uneven trouser legs, one long, one ridiculously short. Those drawings possessed a terrifying, destructive power because you cannot use philosophy to justify a short trouser leg. The world begins to laugh at you not because of your notions of faith, but because of your appearance. They cruelly dig up the old wound with Regine Olsen, drawing you riding on her back like a tyrant with a cane in hand. These attacks target your private life, low and naked, turning the entire inner tragedy of the broken engagement into a cheap farce for the entertainment of the crowd. Copenhagen suddenly becomes a giant glass cage in which you are trapped for public amusement. It has become a public joke. Every time you step out onto the street, the air around you seems to freeze and then burst into whispers. You feel eyes focused on your legs, checking if the two trouser legs are truly uneven today. Children point and burst into laughter as you pass. Street vendors toss out jeering remarks, and even the intellectuals who once respected you now smile ironically. The people baths that were once your lifeblood and the material for your thoughts have now become an unbearable psychological torture. The people baths have become unbearable in their connection to ordinary social life. You cannot go to church. You cannot sit in a cafe without feeling like a target hunted by the arrogance of the public. Those who feel that because the press has mocked you, they too are granted the right to do the same. This public humiliation drives you into absolute isolation, a dark corner where the light of social fame never reaches again. He withdrew into his writing, bitter and isolated. But it is in the darkness of that estrangement that a great philosophical transformation occurs. You realize that this tragedy is the most practical lesson on what you wrote in Fear and Trembling. You are truly standing alone, misunderstood by the crowd, and suffering for beliefs that the world deems madness. What I means to stand alone, to be misunderstood by the crowd, to suffer for convictions others mocked. This pain is no longer an abstract concept. It is blood. It is tears. It is the vibration in every fiber of your being. He saw himself as a kind of martyr and as a witness to the truth. The hatred for the Corsair gradually transforms into a profound critique of modern society. You see in the press and the public a monstrous abstraction, a faceless monster with the power to level all excellence. You fear that in this consumer society, the individual is becoming absorbed into the crowd, a mere member of a herd. You write a literary review with a steely voice, criticizing the present age as an indifferent one, driven by envy and excessive reflection. You realize that the spiritual life of the individual was being stifled by communal, political, and religious illusions. This incident completely redirected the trajectory of your life. Before this, you had completed the massive work concluding unscientific postscript and intended to set down your pen to become a quiet pastor in the countryside. You thought your mission was over. But the mockery of the crowd has ignited a new fire of resistance. You feel a divine call requiring you to remain at your post as an author. You cannot become a pastor while the crowd out there is still pointing at your trousers. You must stay to fight. This is the beginning of the great second authorship, where you abandon ironic pseudonyms to write directly about love, about despair, and about the hollowness of the current church. The Corsair affair did not break you. It liberated you from dependence on reputation so that you could truly become a knight of faith. You rise from the wooden chair, your hands still trembling from the anger that is transformed into iron resolve. You look through the window, seeing the last oil lamps of Copenhagen fading out. leaving a vast night enveloping the streets that once bore the footprints of a strolling gentleman now turned outcast. You reach for your long cloak, not bothering to check your trouser legs, walking resolutely toward the bed. The sound of your shoes tapping on the wooden floor is no longer as rhythmic as before, but carries the weight of a man who has chosen to stand alone against the world as you prepare to sink into a restless sleep, where the ghosts of the crowd will soon give way to the absolute silence of a reclusive life waiting ahead. Part 8. Living in Seclusion and Perfecting Religious Philosophy. You feel the weight of the quill pen on your fingertips, a familiar sensation that now carries a strange decisiveness. The pale yellow light from the flickering candle casts your shadow against the white lime wall of your new room, where silence envelops everything like a thick mist. In 1847, the world outside Copenhagen seems to have become alien and hostile after the storm known as the Corsair. The people baths that were once a source of pure joy, where you stopped to converse with people from all walks of life, are now only a painful memory. Whenever you catch a glimpse of your reflection in the mirror with those uneven trouser legs and thin frame, you hear the laughter of the crowd echoing from the street corners. But instead of collapsing under the weight of humiliation, you choose to retreat into a fortress of isolation. You tell yourself that this is God's will, that you have been chosen to become a witness to the truth, a martyr of thought. This suffering is not the end, but a drastic shift, pushing you away from aesthetic vanities to fully commit to the religious sphere of existence. You stand silently by the window, watching the first snow of the season fall on the streets of Nytorv. On the 9th of November 1847, a final thread connecting you to the earthly world was officially severed. Regine Olsen, the only woman you ever deeply loved, married Fritz Schlegel. The church bells in the distance ring out like a final goodbye, closing all hope for the simple happiness you personally rejected. Only a few weeks later, on December 29, you put your pen to the paper to sign away the house tied to your childhood and your late father. You no longer have a true home, nor a lover to wait for. Those finite entities vanish, leaving you alone amidst a profound spiritual crisis. But it is in that ultimate emptiness, on the 19th of April, 1848, that you feel a powerful awakening piercing through your soul. You write in your journal with overflowing emotion, "My whole nature is changed. My concealment and reserve are broken. I am free to speak." That freedom opened the era of the brilliant, the second authorship. You no longer use anonymous masks to mock the world. You begin to write under your own name about the nature of love. In works of love, you take up the pen to perform surgery on the human heart. You clearly distinguish between selfish love, eros, full of passion but always prioritized, and sacred selfless love, agape. You assert that true love is not a natural emotion, but a strict spiritual duty. God must be the third in every loving relationship so that it does not degrade into possession. You write intensely, "Love is all, it gives all, and it takes all." At the end of the book, you use a long dash as if wishing to erase your ego so that only the Word of God shines through the white pages. You understand that purity of heart is to will one thing. But man is always a contradictory creature, and you understand their despair better than anyone. In July 1849, you borrowed the pseudonym Anticlimacus to publish The Sickness Unto Death. This is an ideal voice, representing a high Christian stature that you yourself feel you have not yet reached. You define the self not as a static entity, but as an active process linking the finite and the infinite, time and eternity. Despair at this point is no longer sadness, but a spiritual sickness when humans fail to become themselves before God. You analyze the despair of possibility that leads humans astray in illusions, and the despair of necessity that makes humans collapse before destiny. You realize the only remedy for the brokenness of the self is faith, the recognition of absolute dependence on the Creator. The sound of your pen still scratches on the paper as the night grows late. In September 1850, Anti-Climacus continues to speak in Practice in Christianity, the book you consider the most important of your career. You want to hurl a stone at the complacency of Danish society, where people consider being a Christian as easy as wearing an old pair of shoes. You call for humans to become contemporary with Christ, to dare to imitate his life of suffering instead of merely admiring him from afar. You explain the offense that God appeared in the incognito form of a lowly servant to test human faith. You want them to understand that faith is not a soothing comfort, but a daring leap into the infinite. During this period, you also completely changed your communication strategy. You abandoned the labyrinths of hidden meaning to speak directly to that single individual, my reader. You use your real name to write polemical discourses such as Christian Discourses or For Self-Examination, aiming directly at the corruption of Christendom. You also secretly write The Point of View for my work as an author, to explain that from the beginning you were always a religious author, and all prior aesthetics were merely a trap to bring people toward faith. You even dissect the Adolf Adler phenomenon to point out the difference between a frivolous, a genius, and a true an apostle of God. Everything you do is directed toward a single purpose: awakening the individuality that is being crushed by the crowd and the press. However, from 1852 to 1853, a strange silence enveloped your pen. Later scholars would call this the period of the gathering storm. You publish almost no more books, but your journals are filled with sharp reflections. This silence is a calculated waiting. You reserve your final respect for Bishop J.P. Minster, your father's old friend, even though you know well he is turning religion into a tool of easy and luxurious politics. You suppress the rage in your chest, waiting for the moment when the truth must explode. Meanwhile, your wealth is gradually depleting, and your health weakens due to overwork and chronic anxiety. You watch the last of your money go, feeling your body wither, but your spirit grows increasingly sharp like a sword being honed in the dark. You set the pen down, feeling a numbness spread from your hand to your shoulder. The candle is burned to its last drops of wax, emitting a pungent and bitter smell of smoke. You rise from the writing desk, your legs slightly unsteady from sitting too long, then slowly walk toward the simple wooden bed. You look through the window, seeing the oil lamps of Copenhagen fading in the early morning mist, feeling an eerie stillness from a city still sunken in complacent sleep. You put on your old cloak, feeling the thin fabric is no longer enough to ward off the cold of solitude, then quietly lie down, your eyes fixed on the darkness of the ceiling. The sound of your breathing echoes steadily in the narrow room, the only sound breaking the silence of these years of seclusion. As you prepare to sink into a deep sleep where ideas of a fierce attack on the church are silently taking shape, awaiting the death of a bishop so they can explode into a storm that sweeps away all falsehood. Part 9. Bishop Minster passes away, and the attack on the church begins. The somber funeral bells from Vor Fru Kirke echo through every alley of Copenhagen, carrying a piercing chill on the morning of the 30th of January 1854. You stand silently by the window, your breath creating a hazy mist on the glass, obscuring the lines of people trudging toward the funeral of Bishop Jacob Peter Minster. The leader of the Danish Lutheran Church, the Bishop of Zealand and primate of the Danish Lutheran Church, has passed away, leaving a vast void in the nation's religious life. For you, Minster's death is not just the end of an era, but the removal of an invisible chain that has suppressed the scream in your chest for so long. Minster was your father's pastor, a friend Michael always revered as a saint among men. You remained silent while he lived, a silence mixed with respect for your father's legacy and the patient waiting of a philosopher who understands the timing of destiny. Was his departure a loss for faith, or was it the final opportunity for you to strip away the falsehood hiding beneath those brilliant velvet robes? You feel the heat of indignation begin to smolder upon hearing that Hans Lassen Martensen, your former teacher, has been appointed as the new bishop. But the true breaking point was not the title. It was the words uttered in the funeral eulogy. Martensen stood before Minster's remains and called him a witness to the truth. Those three words ring in your mind like blasphemy, a spark thrown into the gunpowder magazine of your radical piety. In Greek, the word for witness is synonymous with martyr. Recall the images your father taught you since childhood. Apostles crucified, believers thrown to lions, those who used their blood to vouch for the truth. They were outcasts, insulted, living in caves, and enduring agonizing pain. In stark contrast to that image was Minster's life, a state official living in a palace, receiving a handsome salary, honored with glittering medals, and always praised by society in ultimate comfort. To you, calling someone living in luxury a witness to the truth is a grand deception, an attempt to turn the narrow path of Christ into a broad boulevard for the complacency of the Danish middle class. Following that event, you sink into a silence lasting 10 long months. Copenhagen begins to whisper. People assume you have run out of ideas or have retreated before Martensen's new power. But they do not know you are in the stage of the gathering storm. You imprison yourself in a room full of manuscripts, conversing with your own conscience under the dim oil lamp. You flip through every journal page, wondering if your motive is truly pure or merely personal anger toward Martensen. You realize that the so-called Christendom around you is but a massive illusion. Everyone is born automatically considered a believer. They go to church as a light social duty, while in reality, they only worship their own comforts and safety. The Danish Lutheran Church has ceased to be the Church of Christ. It has turned into a department of the state machinery, a tool to legitimize a bourgeois lifestyle with no room for sacrifice. You understand that you must become the whistleblower, the one who dares to stand up and say, "The king has no clothes," amidst a crowd cheering the fake finery of the ecclesiastical authority. This shift marks a brutal turning point in your method. You decide to abandon indirect communication, the multifaceted pseudonyms, and the intricate philosophical labyrinths you spent 12 years building. The falsehood has become too blatant to use irony as a weapon. You need a direct blow. You discard fictional characters, discard ambiguity, and for the first time you take up the pen as S. Kierkegard, a man of flesh and blood, ready to take responsibility for every word spoken. You move to direct communication because you understand that when the house is on fire, one does not use poetry to warn. One must scream out loud. You are no longer a religious poet on the sidelines. You have become a committed polemicist, a man preparing to enter a battle with no way back. On the 18th of December 1854, you step into the offices of the newspaper Fædrelandet with a manuscript still smelling of fresh ink. The first article appeared like a cannon blast amidst the city's false tranquility. Was Bishop Minster a witness to the truth? One of the true witnesses to the truth? Is this the truth? You write with a cold sharpness, exposing the paradox between Minster's wealth and the asceticism of the apostles. You ask the world how a man sponsored and honored by the state could be in the same rank as those cursed by the world. That writing causes a psychological earthquake. Copenhagen's elite are stunned. They are outraged that you dared touch their deity, dared tarnish the image of the late bishop. Martensen responds with contempt, trying to dismiss you as a madman seeking attention by defaming the dead. But you do not stop. Only 2 weeks later, on December 30, you launch the second strike. There the matter rests. You declare that you will not retract a single word, for this is a battle of truth, not of individuals. You present a harsh demand for honesty. If this society wants to live a comfortable and pragmatic life, then do so. But please do not do it in Christ's name. Do not deceive yourselves that the soothing rituals in church are Christian. The worst deception is living as an atheist while wearing the mask of a believer. You feel a strange freedom as your most honest words are exposed, even though you know the price to pay is the destruction of your remaining social reputation. Declaring war on the church makes you an outcast in your own homeland. Old friends seeing you on the street hurry across the road to avoid having to say hello. The cafes where you were once the center of debates now only offer uneasy glances and malicious whispers. Children again begin to follow the press in mocking you, calling you the destroyer of religious peace. The people haves now truly become a bath in hatred. But you feel you have never lived more truly than now. You are actually experiencing your own philosophy that truth is subjectivity. You stand alone against the crowd, defending the truth even when it brings you contempt. You are not just writing about the leap of faith, you are performing it with your entire life. You have stepped fully into the religious sphere, where all earthly safety is discarded in exchange for an absolute presence before God. You rise from the chair at the newspaper office, feeling the cold air rush in as the door opens. Freshly printed newspapers, still warm, are being stacked in piles, preparing to spread to every corner of the city, carrying your declaration of war. You wrap your wool scarf tightly around your neck, your thin hands tucked deep into your coat pockets, then step outside to face the biting winds of December. The sound of your shoes tapping on the cobblestones rings out decisively and dryly, tearing through the late afternoon silence as you walk toward your solitary room. You walk slowly, head slightly bowed, but your eyes still burn with a steadfast flame. Preparing for the final months, when all your strength and breath will be poured into a total assault on the foundations of the church, leading you to the threshold of utter exhaustion and the death waiting at the end of the road. Part 10. Fierce attack on the church, exhaustion, and death. You feel the chill of the January 1855 morning seeping through your worn-out coat as the pale Nordic winter sun struggles to pierce the thick fog enveloping Copenhagen. This is the final year of the journey, a year in which you know all reserve and hidden meanings must be set aside to make way for a direct battle. You are no longer the silent observer or the philosopher, using pseudonyms to lead readers into a labyrinth. The hypocrisy of the Danish church has become too blatant, like an open wound bleeding in the heart of society. You decide to step out from behind the veil of anonymity, using the name Søren Kierkegard to hurl brutal truths at the faces of those who use God's name for luxury. This is no longer literature. This is an intervention into the soul of an entire nation, a decisive act of words that you are willing to vouch for with your very last breath. Could the world endure the nakedness of an uncompromising faith, or will they choose to bury you under mockery? You recall the first articles in Fædrelandet, where you exposed the lies of Bishop Martensen when he dared to call Minster a witness to the truth. To you, that title belonged to martyrs, those who shed their blood in the dust, not to a bishop living in a palace with a handsome salary. Between December 1854 and May 1855, you wrote a total of 21 articles, each like a knife aimed straight at the complacency of Christendom. You realized that the greatest danger to faith is not atheism, but the trivialization of faith into an automatic habit, a piece of easy inheritance instead of a painful existential choice. The greatest danger to Christianity is not heresy or unbelief, but the trivializing of faith into something easy, something automatic, something inherited instead of chosen. When Fædrelandet began to fear the heat from your pen, you used the last coins of your father's inheritance to give birth to your own magazine, Øjeblikket, or The Moment. In your philosophy, the moment is the intersection of time and eternity, the point where a human must face a life or death choice before God. Throughout the summer of 1855, you published 9 consecutive issues with a ruthless and destructive tone. You called the church a criminal organization, accusing the clergy of being parasites draining the faith of the poor to nourish a lavish lifestyle. You called for people to stop going to church, to stop participating in the fake sacraments of a baptized worldliness. You stood there, alone in the squares of Copenhagen, watching children mock your trouser legs and old friends turn away. Yet within you surged the strange joy of one who has chosen to stand with the absolute truth. But that war exhausted all your resources. The 31,000 Rigsbankdaler inheritance, the lifeblood that nourished your intellect for over a decade, had now completely run dry. You realize you no longer have the money to print the next issue of Øjeblikket, and your body begins to emit its final cries for help. Your twisted spine and a nervous system, always taut like a wire, collapsed under the weight of your frenzied work intensity. On the 2nd of October 1855, while walking the familiar cobblestone streets of Copenhagen, where you once performed your people baths, your legs suddenly lost all feeling. You collapsed onto the cold pavement, watching the shoes of passers-by fade from your sight. Strangers helped bring you home, and later to Friedrich's hospital. The doctors looked at you with pity, as spinal tuberculosis gnawed at your thin frame, but they did not know your soul was preparing for a journey further than any diagnosis. 40 days on a hospital bed were 40 days of ultimate serenity. You lay there, watching the withered sunlight cast through the hospital window, feeling death approaching like an old friend. When your childhood friend, Pastor Emil Boesen, came to your bedside and offered the Holy Eucharist, you looked him in the eye and refused. Yes, but not from a parson. You could not receive the sacrament from the royal functionaries of an institution you had spent your life exposing as blasphemous. The parsons are royal functionaries, and royal functionaries are not related to Christianity. You would rather die in sacred solitude than compromise with falsehood at the last minute. Even when your brother Peter, the symbol of the state church, wanted to visit, you resolutely refused. You did not need the false reconciliation of man. You only needed peace before God. You whispered to Boson, "My life has been one long suffering, but it has also been rich." On the 11th of November, 1855, your breath slowed and then stopped completely in the absolute silence of the hospital room. You passed away at the age of 42, carrying all the paradoxes of a human life into the earth. But even as you closed your eyes, the world would not leave you in peace. A week later, at Vor Fru Kirke, the church you so despised appropriated your remains to perform an ironic official funeral. Crowds of the poor jostled to see the face of the man who had defended them, while religious officials tried to use clever sermons to domesticate your legacy. At Assistens Cemetery, as Dean prepared to lower the casket, your nephew Henrik Lund stood up, shouting your attacks from Øyeblikket to protest the church's appropriation. It was a tragic chaos, a fitting end to the life of one who always lived in the contradiction between social order and individual truth. The final thing you left behind was not gold coins, but a will containing eternal love. You left all copyrights to your works and personal mementos to Regine Olsen. 14 years after the painful broken engagement, you confirmed to the world that the spiritual marriage had never ended. You sacrificed earthly happiness to become a fork, piercing the hypocrisy of the age, but deep down, your heart always belonged to her. Regine refused to accept the assets, but that will was the final love letter, a confirmation that every choice you made was rooted in an infinite love for man and for God. You had completed your mission, lighting the existential fire that would later illuminate an entire turbulent century. You feel your body become weightless, as if all the weight of hereditary melancholy has vanished into the cold wind of Assistens Cemetery. The darkness of the grave is no longer scary, for you know the words you left behind will never die. Your soul begins a new journey, passing over the pointed rooftops of Copenhagen, past the dry sermons of bishops, to fly toward the eternal light you yearned for in every prayer. The footsteps of the crowd gradually fade, leaving only the silence of the earth and sky to embrace you as you slowly dissolve into space, becoming part of the dreams and thoughts of future generations, those who will find themselves in the fear and trembling you once experienced. Conclusion. Søren Kierkegaard, The Final Leap into Eternity. You feel no need to hurry, nor any need to try to understand anything more. All the violent debates, all the bitter attacks, and even the heartbreaking pain from the broken engagement of years past have now settled. The blurred light from the last candle on the writing desk at Friedrich's hospital is fading away, leaving only a fragile border between reality and formless dreams. The philosopher you have accompanied from a sharp fork boy at the family dinner table to a knight of faith who dared to stand alone against the entire world has now dissolved into the gray mist of Assistens Cemetery, like a thin wisp of smoke. But what remains most deeply is a sense of stillness in the left chest, the notion that each of us is a precious single individual before eternity. If we dare to live truthfully to ourselves and dare to perform the leap of faith, then even if the world mocks or forgets, your existence still carries a sacred weight. Søren Kierkegaard walked his path to the end, a road strewn with the broken glass of melancholy, but also shimmering with the light of truth. The sound of his shoes tapping on the streets of Copenhagen has now gone silent, giving way to the absolute stillness of a soul that has found harbor after existential storms. The bells from Vorfru Kirke echo in your mind, gentle as a leaf falling onto the surface of an autumn lake, not causing a disturbance, but only creating peaceful, widening circles. You breathe deeply once more, feeling your chest rise and fall steadily with the rhythm of the void. The silhouette of Søren Kierkegaard gradually fades, leaving you in the protection of the gentle night. Close your eyes. Let the concepts of anxiety or despair dissolve into a deep sleep, where there are no more agonizing choices, only the absolute peace of a soul that has found freedom in faith and eternal love.